Thank you so much, Nicole, and what an emotionally impactful film that is we've just watched, and what a privilege it is to be able to bring this film to so many people tonight. We've got hundreds of people listening in right now, which is really amazing, and conveys actually how interested people are now in this topic. So we will now have our panel discussion until around 8 o'clock. We have an excellent panel assembled for you, and I shall now introduce each of our panelists in turn very briefly. First panelist is Rosie Rizq, Professor Rosie Rizq, Professor of Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy here at the University of Roehampton. She's a psychologist, a psychoanalytic therapist, and has worked in the NHS for over 25 years. And she's also co-editor of the recently published Guidance for Psychological Therapists. And I know there are lots of therapists listening in this evening. This is a very important resource with information we think can help psychological therapists work better with people either taking psychiatric drugs or withdrawing from them. Our next person is Peter Kinderman. He's Professor of Clinical Psychology at the University of Liverpool and previous President of the British Psychological Society. He's also practiced in the NHS as a therapist for many years, and he's author of many, I think, fascinating books on mental health, including A New Prescription for Psychiatry and a Manifesto for Mental Health. Next, we have Dr. Anne Guy, who is a registered psychotherapist in private practice and the coordinator for the all-party parliamentary group for prescribed drug dependence. She's co-editor of the Guidance for Psychological Therapists, and she has researched and written reports for the parliamentary group on current service provision for prescribed drug dependency in the UK. Next, we have Professor Joanna Moncrieff. She works as a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS here in London and is Professor of Critical and Social Psychiatry at University College London. She's currently involved in setting up a de-prescribing service within the NHS to help people come off prescribed psychiatric medication. And she's author of many seminal books, including the highly acclaimed The Myth of the Chemical Cure and the newly published A Straight Talking Introduction to Psychiatric Drugs, which I think came out, possibly last week. It is an excellent book. I've read it. I highly recommend it. Finally, last but not least, we have, of course, Angela Peacock, who just appeared in the film we have all just seen. She is a recent graduate earning a master's in social work from Washington University St. Louis. During her internships, she's worked with military veterans as they've transitioned out of the military and as a therapist in community mental health. And now she works on outreach, on the outreach team of the film we have all just seen. So welcome to all our panelists. What I propose to do now is to ask each panelist a question before opening the discussion to all panelists who will address questions from you, the audience. We're not going to get round all of you. There are hundreds of you, so apologies, but we will field some questions at the very least. So without further ado, I'd like to pose the first question to Joanna, if that's okay. This is I suppose what I want to ask you. Look, I feel we're in the midst of a prescribing epidemic here in the UK. Approaching a quarter of the adult population in England is prescribed one psychiatric drug or another in any given year. And that figure, we believe, is going to continue to rise in the coming years. So as a psychiatrist, as a doctor, why are we prescribing so many psychiatric drugs?
Hi, James. Yeah, thanks for the question. Thank you for inviting me on the panel, everyone, as well. So yeah, really good question. I mean, we saw in the film, we saw Robert Whittaker talking about the influence of the pharmaceutical industry. Clearly, that is a factor. They have poured money into medical education and propaganda and advertising to the medical profession over the last few decades, particularly. And yeah, going back about 20 years, all medical conferences. They were very highly visible. They were, you know, really in your face, huge, big displays. So they've definitely had an influence. I think there are other things going on as well. I think someone mentioned in the film that, you know, psychiatrists do feel insecure. There are lots of other people working in the mental health arena, therapists, psychologists, social workers, and what makes psychiatrists distinct is the fact that they can prescribe medication. So I think that inclines a psychiatrist towards reaching for a prescription pad. And then I think there is, you know, a tendency in our modern society to look for quick fixes and simple answers to complicated questions. I was really struck by the military psychologist who said that we're confusing normal with comfortable. We find it really difficult nowadays to live with pain and suffering and grief. And so we want to medicate it away, or we want to get rid of it in some way. And I think that's, you know, a societal problem that is reflected in doctors' behaviour when they reach out to prescribe medication.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jo. And as you were talking, I was thinking of this startling statistic, which is that there were 7.4 million people prescribed an antidepressant last year in England, not the UK, in England, and only 1 million people prescribed a psychological therapy. Mm-hmm. There's a massive disjunct in provision, and that's not because people all want the drugs. The research shows that most people who consult a GP, for example, would prefer a psychological intervention. They're not getting that because there's this dearth of provision for such alternatives, and maybe that's also partly responsible for driving up rates. Prescribing rates, but that's very interesting. I want to move on now to Peter Kinderman, if I may, Peter. Look, we've heard about the harms that psychiatric drugs can cause so many people, but of course many people report experiencing these drugs as helpful. And so a lot of colleagues are suggesting, well, if the drugs work for you, that's fine. Does it actually matter how people choose to find solutions for their distress? And I wonder if you could address that point for us, Peter.
Thanks, James, and great to be here, and fantastic film. I think it does matter. This isn't an example; it's not a straight analogy. But I think perhaps one of the things to think about is the extent to which we use antibiotics in the food chain, and the way in which people get prescribed antibiotics for viral illnesses. And one of the reasons why that's a dangerous thing is because then the level of antibiotic resistant pathogens out there in the world grow because of our inappropriate use of antibiotics. And I think similarly, if what happens is, as a culture, as a civilization, we turn to quick fixes that change the brain chemistry to solve problems in our lives, I think there's a risk that our children are taught inappropriate lessons. We don't develop the ways of coping and responding as individuals, living in societies and talking to our friends. We search for dangerous, short-term and physiologically damaging solutions to our problems. So I wouldn't want to deny anybody a solution that helps them in the immediate terms. But I think as a collective response, we don't want to be building up biological damage and inappropriate ways of coping with our tragedies in life that cause potential impacts on future generations. So I wouldn't deny anybody something that helps, but I think we need to be very, very cautious about, as a society, moving in that direction.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I think we talked about a dearth of alternatives, and perhaps there's also a dearth of caution as well. Lots of people taking medications, and of course, as a consequence, working as a psychotherapist, it's inevitable, and the research shows this too, you're going to be working with clients who are taking psychiatric drugs. And this, I think, brings me on to Rosie, if I may. Rosie, you're an editor of the Guidance, and you've written on this topic, and you have a huge amount of experience working as a therapist for 25 years. I suspect you've seen countless people who have taken prescribed medicines. In your view, what are the important things psychological therapists need to think about when working with someone who is taking prescribed psychiatric drugs?
Well, thank you, James. That's a huge question, and that was, of course, the basis of the guidance that we've been working on over the last year or two. But I think one of the most important things I've come to understand is to really think about the client's relationship to psychiatric drugs. As we've seen, people very often take drugs because they see themselves as ill in some way and in need of treatment with a drug, or they see that they've got some very unpleasant feelings of sadness or anger or shame, and they want a quick fix to take those feelings away. And as Peter was saying just now, we need to really think about that, and therapy, of course, is designed to help people to manage their feelings, not to actually take those feelings away from them. I think the film showed so well how drugs can shut people down. The other thing I think that's very important to think about when we're working with clients in therapy is, of course, our own relationship as therapists to these drugs. Many of us are patients too. Many of us have taken one or more of these drugs ourselves. So I think it's very important for us to reflect on our own relationship to these drugs, our own relationship to what we call the medical model, because I think that has a big impact on how we think about and work with people in this way. I mean, as well as that, of course, there's the importance of thinking about the adverse effects and the sort of withdrawal symptoms that go with some of these drugs. And I think that's very important too, in terms of understanding the nature of informed consent in therapy. We heard in the film about the importance of informed consent when taking a drug, but there's also the fact of informed consent when undertaking therapy. And arguably, I think people might need to know something about the potential impact of these drugs before they embark on therapy, so that they're in a position to know about exactly what they're taking on, and the limits of what might be possible in therapy if they're taking some of these drugs. And maybe just very quickly, I do want to say something about the importance here, because I know many practitioners and many of my trainees have felt very worried about the sort of discussion of the client's medication in therapy. And I think there's a very big difference here that we need to bear in mind as practitioners, as therapists, between giving medical advice and giving medical information. Of course, any specific questions about the type, dosage or frequency of psychiatric drugs should always be referred back to the practitioner. But I think in the guidance, what we're very clear about is that discussing sort of scientific evidence or sharing information from a particular and reputable source, or offering a different perspective on the work, differs quite a lot from actually offering a diagnosis or prescribing any kind of specific drug or advising somebody to withdraw from medication. Those are matters that are best left to prescribers. We're offering something different as therapists, different and distinctive.
Thank you so much, Rosie. As a psychotherapist, someone who previously worked in the NHS, I remember working out pretty soon that people have relationships to drugs. They become internalized objects, so to speak, to have recourse to that Winnicottian phrase, and investigating the ways in which these relationships people have with objects, with diagnoses, with medications, impact upon their functioning in the present, and so on and so forth, is, I think, also very important. That was really interesting. Rosie, thank you very much. So you're talking about how working with people who were taking drugs. Anne, I want to come to you and ask you a little bit about the process of withdrawing from medicines themselves, and what psychotherapists can do and counsellors can do to help facilitate people during what can be oftentimes very difficult processes of withdrawal.
Yeah, thank you, James. I guess there are two parts to this that I'd like to address, and one is, first of all, as therapists, being able to help clients and being able ourselves to identify when our clients might actually be experiencing withdrawal already or have experienced it in the past. So I've had a client say to me, gosh, I really know I need these drugs because when I miss a dose, I really notice it. My boyfriend says I really must need them because if I miss it, he can tell. And of course, when I perhaps suggested that they might be experiencing the effect of missing the drug, not actually the idea that some underlying version of themselves reappeared when they missed a drug, it was a revelation. The idea that actually there was a response to the lack of the drug, and just flagging that as a possibility can be so important. So it's not necessarily when somebody is saying, gosh, I'm ready to come off, what should I do? Or I'm in withdrawal now, how can you help? It's actually every day in the work that we do. Once we're aware of this issue, we can hear when it might be having an effect. And sometimes somebody will say to you, even at the start of therapy, oh yes, well, I've been on antidepressants for years, or I've tried to come off them, but I was unwell again, or my depression came back. And so often what we are now learning is that withdrawal effects are mistaken as a return of an illness or a previous condition, a resurgence of something, rather than being recognized for the very chemical and physiological effects of drugs leaving their system and the impact physiologically. And this dramatically impacts how we as therapists can actually help somebody prepare for withdrawal, go through it and support them during, because it's actually quite a physiological process. And sometimes we need to actually suspend some of our normal ideas of what we would do during therapy when somebody's in withdrawal. Because in the film, we heard David talk about the tremendous terror and panic that he experienced when he was coming off his drugs. And it was unlike anything he'd experienced before. And when you listen to people who go through withdrawal, they talk about the quality of sometimes these feelings, emotions that they're feeling is almost like having a chemical feel to them, that they know it's not really them, that it's an extreme version of a feeling. And so these are directly attributable to the drug and the drug's impact on the system. And if we as therapists start trying to interpret those in a psychological way and say, okay, exploring them in a way we might normally do in therapy, we start locating that problem with them as an individual rather than with the drug. And I was conscious of when Angie in the film was talking about so many times being told that what was going on was her, when actually it was about the drug. And so being awake, being able to hear when these impacts might be the drug and not the person, that's step one. That's a huge step for us as therapists, so that we are not compounding the harm that some of these drugs may be doing. And just being aware is a huge, huge step. There are then a whole load of things that we can do to help somebody prepare for an attempt to withdraw. They're going to need the support of a really knowledgeable prescriber. They're going to need to have a tapering plan. They're going to need all sorts of practical things that a medic needs to provide. But then there are all sorts of emotional readiness and practical stuff that we can help as therapists, help somebody think through. And very often we're in an advantageous position of already having a relationship with somebody when they get to the point of thinking, I want to come off these drugs. And a relationship that they simply may not have with the prescriber. So I would just say to people, you might be feeling a lack of confidence in your ability to support somebody, but if you don't do it, who will? And actually the guidance is there, the guidance that we've produced is there to enable us to be in that position, to be able to be that person, that human contact who can actually reassure somebody when they're going through withdrawal that they're going to come out the other end, that this is a physiological effect. So it's quite a different way of working, but one that we're all perfectly capable as therapists of doing. And I think that's the key. This guidance is an invitation to people to educate ourselves so that we can be in that position of being able to offer that support to people at that time. preparing, going through it, and then adjusting to life afterwards. There's a lot more detail in the guidance, obviously, but I'll leave that there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That was really helpful, Anne. Yes, misreading withdrawal as relapse, as the original problem returning, and the drugs being reinstated as a consequence. And there's sufficient research now to lead us to conclude that this dynamic has played a role in why people are on these drugs longer and longer and longer. So the average duration of time people spend on an antidepressant, for example, has doubled in the last 15 years. And if you have doctors misreading withdrawal reactions as relapse, you can understand why that would happen. And it is of course concerning. And you mentioned Angie just now, and how this dynamic played itself out in her experience. So I'd like to bring Angie in. Hello, Angie. Look, you've been through so much, and you're so courageous, and it was an honor to hear your story in the film. I would like to know whether you could perhaps talk about what it was like to train as a social worker and as a therapist in the light of your lived experience in the mental health care system.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Yes, I would think, well, the training for me was slightly traumatic because I was going through the withdrawal experience. That's an isolating experience. I'd had very few people to talk to. I did have a therapist that she didn't quite understand it, but I was able to explain it to her, and she was more open-minded than most, so I could bring my feelings to her, and she would validate and reassure me that I would be better, and just takes time, and it will be fine. And then meanwhile, the contrast of being at school, sitting in a chair with akathisia, which is a movement disorder where you can't stop moving and you have all these horrific thoughts and you have that chemical feeling running through your body. And so the other thing that really impacted me was just the lack of this information within the US training system of therapists. So I kept thinking, oh my God, my class of 273 new social workers have no idea this even exists. And lastly, I took a psychopharmacology class on purpose because basically I had to teach myself psychopharmacology to come off the drugs by myself under a little bit of doctor help, but not much. And I had been on so many, I knew what all of them were and how they work and side effects and all that. I never knew about withdrawal until it happened to me, but, interestingly enough, but so I took the psychopharmacology class, and when we got to the section on antidepressants and antipsychotics, it was like I could teach the class, So my pharmacy teacher, he was a pharmacist for like 35 years. He actually came to one of our screenings in St. Louis when I did 180 counseling students, and he stood up at the end and he came to the front and he said, he was like, had tears in his eyes and said, you taught me so much being in your class, and now seeing this movie, oh my God, every pharmacist needs to see this. We need more training. So, I think there's this disconnect between, like, these things happen to these people, these mental health people, these people with diagnosis, but it's like, it's happening to our whole society. And there's this missing link where, like, this is real and it's harmful and it's scary and has so many implications for our society, children, elderly, adults, women who are pregnancy age that don't get informed consent, all these things that are happening. And I don't even think we know the full impact. So that's what it was like for me. Wait, one more thing. Wait. Sorry. Oh, and also being a therapist. So I did the outpatient therapist training. I trained in trauma therapies because I did not want to do any of the CBT, CPT, all these lettered therapies. So I did more of a Gestalt dialogue approach. And the one thing that struck me was never in those 14 months did I meet anyone that I felt like I needed to refer to a psychiatrist, or to diagnose them. It was, and I felt like those things that we learned in school were actually coming between me and the client. Like, I just want to be there and listen and validate you. And then meanwhile, I'm finding myself thinking about all these things like, okay, well, that's a family system problem. And so that goes here and this goes there. And it's like, that's taking me away from being with the person.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Angie, for that. Well, look, we should move on. We have some questions now that are coming from the audience, and I want to pose a couple of those to the panel, if I may. So I think this is on a lot of people's minds at the moment. So I'm going to raise this as an issue. It's a bit of a hot potato, but there we go. Here goes the question. What are your thoughts on the push for psychologists to become medical prescribers in the UK? So for those of you who don't know, there's a proposal to give prescribing rights to British psychologists so that they're able to prescribe psychopharmaceuticals alongside medical doctors. Who would like to take that one on first?
Well, I'm involved in the debate within the British Psychological Society. I think it's a terrible idea. I think it's an unnecessary idea. I do think that there is absolutely a value for having experienced, medically qualified people, not only dealing with folk who are taking medication for obvious reasons to help them manage medication, help them get off medication, but also in primary mental health care teams. We are biopsychosocial creatures. The functioning of our bodies and the functioning of our brains is an important part of the equation. So I definitely want my medical colleagues as part of the team, but I don't want everybody reaching out for a prescription pad. I think it's a power grab by psychologists who want to embed themselves even more fully into the medical model and hope to get some of the shiny gloss. If you haven't got a BMW 5 Series, then maybe if you've got prescription privileges, it'll help you in that way. I think it's a terrible idea. On the film, we saw somebody saying that they went to their therapist and was surprised that the therapist said that they'd kickstart the therapy by giving them a psychotoxic drug. That's what we'll get. I think that it is not at all difficult to find a medical practitioner who will give you medication. It's actually quite difficult to find a therapist who will give you an alternative. And that's what we need to be pushing. More alternatives, more people who will offer a counterpoint to therapy, and actually, in truth, better trained and better qualified medical consultants to the primary care and secondary care mental health teams will be able to know what these damn drugs do to our synapses, rather than do the diagnosis, reach for the prescription, get people on drug. I think it's a terrible idea. I'm opposed to it, and we've got Trump and we've got Brexit and we've got coronavirus, and this is another thing to feel despair about, to be honest.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Would anybody else like to comment on this?
Can I comment, James?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me want to say that I sympathise with what you're saying. We probably don't want more prescribers of these horrible toxic drugs, that are mostly unnecessary and harmful. But psychiatrists and GPs are not good prescribers and need a lot more and very different information. Like Angie was saying, she can teach a class probably better than a specialist psychopharmacologist. The training that psychiatrists get in psychopharmacology is completely inadequate. It doesn't even start to tell you what you're doing when you prescribe someone a drug, what those drugs might be doing to the brain, and how little we know about what they are doing to the brain. So we really need much better education for the people that are prescribing. Quite apart.
Can I just add something? Can I add something else? I think Joanna's made such an important, well, both Peter and Joanna have made a really important point. We do indeed need better educated psychiatrists and prescribers, but we need better educated therapists too, who are able to discuss these things with prescribers. And of course, we're straight into the issue of hierarchy and so forth in public sector services and in the way we look at medicine and psychiatry in particular. But it can't be helped. I think that part of the reason behind the guidance was to encourage and empower and invite therapists to become better informed about the evidence base and to acquire knowledge of the information that enables them to discuss as colleagues with our medical prescribers the difficulties that their clients may have when they're trying to withdraw from these drugs. So I do agree that we need better educated psychiatrists, but I think that must apply to psychological therapists as well, and we're hoping very much that the guidance is part and parcel of that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? If not, I can bring in another question. Okay, thank you. So we have another question here. This is an interesting one. In the UK, welfare disability payments are pretty contingent on being on medications and having a diagnosis, is there a danger that in categorizing conditions such as depression and complex trauma, in categorizing them as normal, we will undermine people's basic need for financial support? Who would like to talk to that question?
Okay.
I'll share a little bit. Oh, well, Joanna, you go first. I'll go after you.
Okay, so Jo first, then Angie. Yeah.
I think it is such a crucial question, and I don't think we will deal with this problem of overprescribing until we've dealt with it. You know, we won't be able to get rid of the dominance of the medical model, the medical approach to understanding human problems, if we tie welfare to having a medical problem. And we need to find another way of acknowledging that people can have difficulties, can, you know, need some time off work, or may not be able to work, may need some care, may need some help, may need some support without necessarily having a medical problem. And it's really, really fundamental. And it goes back to the whole issue of how do we gatekeep society's resources? How do we allocate them? And at the moment, we've decided that doctors are gatekeepers, and you have to have a medical condition, a medical diagnosis to access health resources or care resources. There must be other ways of doing it. You know, we must be able to think of other ways of allocating resources, of allocating care.
Well, I completely agree with you, but I'd add another point, which is that if we were to allocate resources and care on the basis of need and on the basis of the events that happen in people's lives that lead them to need help. So for instance, if we were to think about children who are suffering, and instead of putting them on Ritalin or giving them antidepressants, but think about what they need educationally in order to protect them from bullying or to progress in schools. If we were to think of people who live with abusive partners, if we were to think about people whose businesses are failing or whose jobs are at risk, and think about the consequences of those events on people's lives, two things would happen, I think. First of all, I think we could design exactly the system you're talking about, Jo, where people get benefit and resources and help commensurate with their needs and with the problems that they're experiencing, but we would also be moving towards prevention. And the thing about treating the so-called disorders that are consequent upon these challenges in people's lives as disorders, medicating people for depression and so forth, is that it's then a separate business to go back and do the preventative work. But if what you're doing is responding to somebody whose business is collapsing by offering them financial support, business advice, a short-term loan in order to get their business back on track, and some legal advice, you're doing prevention as well as treatment. So I think we absolutely can design that system, and it would be a damn good thing if we did.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, Peter. Angie.
Yeah, I have personal experience with this because I'm on disability in the US, and I'm terrified on a daily basis that one day they'll discover that I'm not taking any medications for that, and I will be taken off. And then at that point, I will be homeless. And the only thing I can say in my defense, if that comes up, you know, I have it documented in my records that I've had all these adverse reactions to drugs. I've tried over 45 psychiatric drugs. I don't know what more you want me to do. And not to mention that I'm disabled even more because of the drugs. So now I live with neurological disturbance, visual. I have like 5 different visual syndromes now that were caused by the psychiatric drugs themselves. So even when we say that things are normal, it doesn't mean that they're not disabling. Like, the suffering is real. Why can't we compensate the suffering, not your adherence to your treatment?
But
Yes,
maybe, Angie, it is in part because by tying benefits to the individual becomes responsible. And I think this is one of the issues that we're facing here, the issue of what we call psychocompulsion. You know, unemployment has fast become a psychological issue. Mm-hmm. It's not a social issue, not a political issue, but a psychological issue for which you, me, and everybody else are personally responsible. And I think that's one of the more pernicious effects of the overdiagnosis and the medication of distress. Certainly here in the UK, you see, and from what you're saying in the US as well. And I think we do have to find it. It cannot be right to tie benefits to the taking of psychiatric drugs. That is mad.
Yeah.
Well, and the multiple other things, like for me, I can't take drugs now, so I have to do a myriad of different things to, like, sleep, eat healthy. I have to eat a healthy food, or I can't function. You know, there's all these other things that I have to do to maintain any semblance of functionality at all. So we need alternatives, that it's not just drugs that people do to feel better. There's other things also. And so far in the US, you can get away with that. I just don't know how long.
Anne, I saw you raise.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, you know, from a counselling and therapeutic point of view, we do always have to be very mindful of the choices that are actually available to clients at any particular point in time. You know, if they've been sectioned, if they've been forced to take drugs, or if their benefits are dependent on, you know, on them, then they may feel absolutely that there are only a certain range of options open to them, and we have to support clients wherever they are at, and be mindful of the impacts of sometimes legal frameworks actually that are impinging on their choices that are actually available to them, and that's part of what we need to be aware of when we're supporting clients.
There are lots of important points there. I mean, I heard almost to medicalize distress is to depoliticize distress by default. Mm-hmm. Yeah. To demedicalize distress is not to delegitimate distress. One can honor and respect and care for profound suffering. You can still do that without calling profound suffering that can be life-threatening illness and disorder. There's another narrative that can be brought to the table which acknowledges how terrible suffering can be for people, but at the same time doesn't add to that the ascription of illness or dysfunction. And another point being, you know, built into the system is the necessity for medicalization. And so you have to be medicalized to receive your benefits, but you also have to be medicalized as a precondition for receiving any care at all in the NHS. The NHS pretty much, and I know, Peter, you've got some thoughts on this, but broadly speaking, medicalization is kind of the gatekeeper to services. Even if in IAPT you have to undertake the PHQ-9, which is a diagnostic tool, you have to do that before you get therapy. So built into the system is this trope which keeps the trope alive. I'm so surprised how quickly this has gone. Actually, we're scheduled to finish at 8 o'clock, and it's 7:55, and it feels like we're all just getting warmed up. So I will give one final question to the pan. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should honor what's expected of me, which is to keep to time. And Angie shaking her head, and shaking her head.
It's a good question. Ask it, I think.
Well, it's something that the film alludes to, and it's the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and psychiatry. Now, the relationship between psychiatry and pharma has changed in recent years. To some extent. But the relationship was very, very strong, and it established the system under which we pretty much operate today. And it still exists, that relationship, exerting influence behind the scenes. Just wanted to petition some thoughts on, and this relates to the question from someone from the audience, what more do we need to do to interrupt the problems that this relationship is bringing into mental health care? Any thoughts from?
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yes.
So nationalised pharmaceutical companies would be my suggestion. I think, you know, as long as you're making profit out of selling drugs to numb people, to deal with people's distress, we will get these problems. You know, pharma's doing all the research, as Robert Whittaker said in the film. They've got all the data, they can manipulate it. There have been various regulations to try and deal with that, but, you know, they are still managing to get around it. I think doctors have got a little bit more savvy. I wanted to say, I think the situation in the UK is not quite as bad as it is in the US, and doctors do prescribe fewer benzodiazepines here. But still are, doling out a lot of antidepressants, fairly oblivious to the dependence-inducing effects of antidepressants. And, we used lots of pregabalin when that came along. So, yeah, I think you've got to take the profit motive away, basically.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's a similar problem in drug regulation with the MHRA, which is our drug regulatory agency. The part of the agency that regulates medicines is 100% funded by fees from the pharmaceutical industry. It's run by ex-industry professionals, and there's an argument to say that this arrangement is leading to the bar to be set very low for what you need to do in order to get a drug approved for public use, or to get a drug removed from the market, owing to some of the harms it's causing. Peter?
I completely agree with Joe that we should nationalise the pharmaceutical industry. I'm generally an old-fashioned socialist, and generally I think that the fact that Google has to change its search algorithm so that when you type in "why has capitalism fails," it deliberately changes your search terms. It gives an indication why capitalism fails, and it leaves human detritus in its path. So yeah, completely agree with you. But there are things we can do between here and there. So one of the things is that drugs are licensed for use on the basis of short-term trials that don't follow up long-term harms, and where the people manufacturing the drugs generally get to choose what the positive outcome measures are and which side effects they look for. If we change the regulatory system so that drugs were not licensed for use, could not make money for the profiteers if they weren't tested long-term, and with outcomes, including adverse outcomes, defined by the users rather than defined by the people who make profit, we'd go a long way towards regulated process. So we could change the regulatory structure in order to improve things. Problem is, as you say, the regulatory industry, or the regulatory arms of the industry, is funded by the industry. So we could knock that on the head if we wanted to.
But I think drugs aren't licensed for long-term use. Antidepressants are only licensed for long-term use in certain situations. They just get prescribed long-term because that's what happens. So my concern is that it wouldn't be enough just to tighten up regulation. Sorry, Rosie.
Sorry, I'm trying to burst in here before we finish. But I think those things are extremely important. But I perhaps coming from a sort of educative background, I think I want to say that we need to educate the next generation of doctors, psychiatrists, psychological therapists, mental health practitioners, social workers, arts, drama, music, play therapists. All our therapists need to be educated in these things so that we can actually affect a shift in attitude and a shift towards a paradigm shift, maybe even we're talking about here is there need to be multiple places where this shift takes place, but I think education is always where it starts, and I think that's partly where the guidance is coming from that we've been talking about.
Yes, and my dream is just that patients will stop using services so much, and we will work you all out of a job so that we don't need to keep this going. So that's my rebellious spirit speaking, to stop going.
Good. Vote with your feet. Yes. Well, excellent. I'm going to ask you all now for just a closing thought each before we hand back to Nicole. I'm going to ask you, Peter, if you could go first.
So I think one of the things we haven't mentioned yet is human rights, and I'd refer to the extremely positive reports by Darius Puras, Human Rights Rapporteur for the United Nations, who talked about how moving away from an overly medicalized approach to mental health care is a way of protecting the human rights of those of us who use mental health services and might use mental health services in the future. So just as you said that diagnosis and medication and the conceptual models of mental illness are linked, I think we need to bring in rights and the rights of people using our services as well.
Thank you, Peter. Angie, would you like to give us.
Well, I'm gonna go last, so you all go in front of me.
Okay. Okay. Jo.
Hi. Yes, I didn't say earlier how moved I was by the film. I watched it actually a couple of days ago, and it really had me in tears. And your story in particular, Angie, was so so sad. But actually, there is a message of hope at the end, and I think that is really important to say. That it does seem, I know, you know, these withdrawal symptoms can be really awful, really crippling. But it does seem that gradually they at least get milder and more easy to live with and to manage. So I just wanted to highlight that. I think that comes out of the film really beautifully, despite the, you know, terrible suffering people have been through along the way. And I wanted to mention something else, and that links up with Peter's point. Choice. People do generally, unless you're under the Mental Health Act, have a choice about whether to take these medicines in the first place and whether to continue with them. And I know it's really difficult when your doctor is saying, yes, you should take this, yes, you should continue, oh no, you shouldn't stop, you should take this extra one or this new one. But actually they can't make you. And, you know, shop around, find someone who is going to support your, you know, what you want to do about your medication. That's my message to people.
Thank you so much, Jo. Excellent. Anne, over to you.
Yes, I'd just like to add how important it is that as therapists, if we educate ourselves in this key issue, that we make ourselves available to people so that we can be people who can support people choosing to withdraw or choosing not to take drugs in the first place, or being a place where they can just talk and get in key information, evidence-based information. So if you do read our guidance, if you come on one of our training events, and we've got one coming up on the 21st of November, and you'll be emailed some information after this event about that, please update your information online, or wherever you advertise yourself, to say that you understand about issues of prescribed drug dependence. Help clients find you so that they know that you get this, that you can help them through, because there are so few people out there who really do understand it, that it can be so hard for people to find somebody to really help them. So if you do educate yourself, put it on your profile. You may feel inexperienced, but it's so important that we start showing that we're listening and that we're hearing, that we're understanding, that we've educated ourselves, and to start having these conversations more openly with our clients. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anne. And finally to you, Rosie, before we close with Angie.
I think I was just sort of remembering my own training as a counselling psychologist, and how little, I don't think anything was spoken about psychopharmacology, or certainly not working with prescribed psychiatric drugs. And I think if anything, this is still very much the case in a lot of training institutions today. And if anything, people are taught to defer to doctors and psychiatrists in any matter relating to psychiatric drugs. And I think the sort of take-home message for me as a psychological therapist, any mental health practitioner who's with us tonight, I think you're all really well placed to help people who are struggling with this issue. And I do hope that you'll want to have a look at the guidance and get some ideas about how to work with people who are struggling with prescribed drugs and struggling perhaps to withdraw from them, because the guidance encourages you to work on the basis of evidence and information. And I think if we're armed with evidence and information, that enables us to do a great deal more. Also, just to say, after this event, each and every one of you is going to be able to help us shape training events. If you participate in a very short survey that we're going to be sending out to you, like often you get sent these surveys, I know, but this one's a really important one. We really want to know what you think. So very many thanks if you can just spend a few moments filling it in and sending it back to us. We're really grateful. Thank you. And I just want to thank Angie and Nicole and the whole Medicating Normal team for making this event possible. It's been a really terrific experience, and of course I want to thank all hosts and members for coming along and making this such an exciting and interesting event.
Thank you, Rosie.
All right.
Final word then to you, Angie.
Yeah, just a couple words about the film. We did sign a deal with the UK distributor, so it will be in the UK before it will be in the US. So we will keep you posted on that. Also, we have a website, it's medicatingnormal.com, and there's more ways to watch with more screenings like this. So if you want to share it with anyone you think you should watch the film, please refer them there. And every day we post articles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so you could get supplemental material to this. And our YouTube channel has over 120 clips so far and many discussions just like this one. So I just wanted to say thank you from our team for coming and for being open-minded, open-hearted, and for, you know, taking on this courageous feat of the shifting paradigm that needs to happen. So thank you all so much. Rosie.
Thank you all, for everyone for joining, and thank you to our panelists and James for hosting the discussion, and to Nicole for getting us technically through all of this. And I do hope we'll continue the debate afterwards. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.